Okay, and so the last type of large molecule, the last type of macromolecule that we're going to talk about is nucleic acids. And so let's go ahead and go through this part. So for nucleic acids, the monomer is called a nucleotide, all right? And you may have heard of some of them: guanine, adenosine, cytosine, thymine, uracil, okay? Those are examples, but the monomer is called a nucleotide, and then the polymer is called nucleic acid. And examples of that are DNA or RNA, but keep in mind the polymer is called a nucleic acid. Now, for our purposes, we're really not going to focus on RNA too much. I really want to talk about DNA and what DNA is and what it does, okay? So you may have commonly heard DNA referred to as the genetic material. And what is that? What does it do? Okay. Well, the genetic material are the things that we inherited. So, for example, I have brownish hair and blue eyes. Well, I inherited that from my parents. And DNA is the physical thing that came along in sperm and egg and made me, that now gives me those characteristics. How does it do it? Okay, this is important, and I really want you to get this, is that DNA contains the information on how to put together proteins. Remember, proteins do almost everything in the cell. And so how does a cell know to put together proteins, how to do that? It does it because DNA contains those instructions. Okay, so let me use my building blocks here and hopefully explain this a little bit more. Okay, so DNA has the option of 4 different subunits. Okay, now DNA, it's found on chromosomes in the nucleus, and you literally have millions of these subunits stuck together. And they can be put together in any order, okay? So here is maybe a little segment of DNA. Here's the nucleotide. You put it together to get a nucleic acid. And the type we're talking about is the DNA nucleic acid. Okay, so how does the cell take this strings of those 4 different subunits stuck together? How does it take this and use it to make a protein? This is a brief overview. Okay, what it does is it looks at the first 3. It's a code, and it says, wow, I've got, adenine, guanine, and cytosine. Okay, so I've got those 3. If I see those 3 together, that means I put this amino acid as my first amino acid. All right. Now let's look at the next 3. 1, 2, 3. And notice it's a different code. Okay? And so we'd say, hey, the next part, the next amino acid we need to hook into this protein is this one. Okay? Let's look at the next code. We've got 1, 2, 3. Notice it's different. Well, so let's hook in our next amino acid. So this is the code. It's the blueprint, the instructions, and what we get out of it is amino acids hooked together in the correct order. Okay, so what that means is if a part of the code is mutated, so let's say we have this, the green instead of the red. Well, what that means is instead of making this, because we've now got green instead of red, it's going to say, well, let's stick this in. And now we've got a different protein. And remember, different structure gives you different function. Okay, so why is this so exciting? And this is something that I share with my classes. One, you should know, here's Michael J. Fox. Many of you probably know that he has Parkinson's disease. He's an advocate for people living with Parkinson's. And it's a problem with the DNA. His DNA is mutated, and so he makes mutated proteins that don't have the right function, and that gives him this disease where he shakes and it becomes progressively more difficult to use his muscles properly. Okay, now this is important theme. Structure relates to function. So if you have a piece of DNA and it gives you instructions for a protein with a specific function, they have taken goats and they have taken the DNA that is normally found in a spider. They have taken, and it causes that spider to make silk, and it's very hard to harvest this type of silk. Okay, you can imagine how hard it would be. Well, instead, they've taken that DNA. It's got instructions for the protein that makes spider silk. They put it in a goat and made it so that silk now comes out of the goat's milk. Making spider goat. But if this goat has the DNA instructions for making the protein with a function, it's going to work. Okay? So, and then they can harvest that silk much more easily from the goat milk than they can this way. Okay. Another case, this over here says dead rat cloned. Okay. This thing was a rat that had been sitting in the freezer for 20 years, but its DNA, its instructions were intact. They took those instructions, they put it inside of a live egg, and this is what they got, because that DNA had the instructions for making proteins that did all the functions of life. And here you got a live rat from one that had been dead. They just took the instructions from the dead one that had been dead for 20 years. And so now people are asking, is this one of the steps for us recreating extinct species? Okay, now of course, this isn't the same question as should we do it, but it's a very different question from can we do it. Okay, so but scientifically we're getting to the point where we can. Okay, and then of course that brings up this other idea: can we completely make life in the lab if we have these DNA instructions? So DNA is very important. Gives the instructions for proteins, which do all the functions, almost all the functions of the cell, which are important for life. That, of course, then brings up these ethical, potentially ethical issues that have to be explored further. But not in this class. This is anatomy and physiology, but a good bioethics class would be good for that. So this is why we care about nucleic acids, and in fact, the two gentlemen that first cracked the structure of DNA, they knew structure was so important for function that these two men, Watson and Crick, Watson had looked at some data from Rosalind Franklin, I should say without her permission, but he did. And so they came up with the correct structure for DNA. And when they came up with it, they were so excited that they ran down to the local pub in England. And one of them, as they went in the door, yelled out, "I have discovered the secret of life." So this was how important knowing the structure of DNA was for the function of DNA, and thus the function